Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Logos Project. This is your host, Dom. And this morning I've been studying, and I brought some excerpts together from various texts and thought I'd actually make a video on the fruit of my morning study. So, in this video, I'm going to be talking about a Catholic theology of religions. So, I'm not going to be using the book that I'm about to show you. Um, but I do want to show it to you because I think it is the best book on this topic. It's by Joseph Ratzinger. This book I loved so much, I thought it was better than his Introduction to Christianity. It's not spoken of that much, but it is one of the best things he's written, in my estimation. So I strongly recommend it to anybody studying theology or studying a theology of religions. Of course, I'm speaking of Truth and Tolerance by Joseph Cardinal Ratzinger. Excellent book, strongly recommend. Also, just a caveat, it is raining outside. There's a bit of a storm, so I really hope that my internet won't be messy. So I'll check again when I'm done with the video to see what things look like. I hope everything will be fine. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to begin with the letter that Pope Benedict, at the time emeritus, wrote to Reverend Father Dave Pivonka, who is the head of the Franciscan order at the Franciscan University of Steubenville in Ohio. In 2022, um, there was a conference on the ecclesiology of Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI, and for that occasion, the Pope Emeritus wrote a letter to Father Pivonka. And it's a beautiful and great letter. I recommend people read it. You can find it online for free. There's a PDF through the Franciscan website. You can just Google it, though. And there's one particular quote in the letter that is a great way to kick off our discussion of this topic. And the quote is as follows. Quote, "For the first time, the question of a theology of religions had shown itself in its radicality. The same is true for the relationship between faith and the world of mere reason. Both topics had not been foreseen in this way before. This explains why Vatican II at first threatened to unsettle and shake the Church more than to give her a new clarity for her mission. In the meantime, the need to reformulate the question of the nature and mission of the Church has gradually become apparent. In this way, the positive power of the Council is also slowly emerging." End quote. So, obviously, the first line is what's most of interest for us today, which is when he says, "For the first time, the question of a theology of religions had shown itself in its radicality." That being said, I do want to highlight the second sentence, which is equally as important, as we'll see, which goes as follows. "The same is true for the relationship between faith and the world of mere reason." Especially in the Western world, for us, that is extremely relevant, right? The secular sphere and the direction it's taken, the relationship between faith and reason, and also the question of world religions, the globalization of our history. And a lot of this is addressed in the Regensburg Address by Pope Benedict XVI, which we'll take a look at shortly. So that's the first thing I wanted to read from to kind of kick us off. The next thing I wanted to do is make a preliminary exposition of a particular theological concept that I hope will inform everything we'll explore subsequently. And this concept is, it's actually kind of a negative concept, right? It's what's called extrinsicism. Some of you already know of this term, but for those of you who don't, extrinsicism is when particular realities or concepts, right, are seen as needing to belong together and therefore are brought together in theology or in discourse. But the issue with the word extrinsicism, right, with the concept of extrinsicism, is that although it recognizes that certain things need to belong together, it unwittingly presupposes their initial disparity. That's an important point. I'm going to re-say that, right? Extrinsicism is an understanding that certain things belong together, like faith and reason, for example, or church and state, but that unwittingly, right, unbeknownst to itself, presupposes a prior disparity, a prior um, dualism, right? And so understanding so much of Catholic theology revolves around understanding this concept of extrinsicism. At least that's been the fruit of my study, is realizing this. And so, just to give you an example, right? When we look at philosophy and theology, there was a great debate over this in the 20th century. Very fascinating conversation. When we look at philosophy and theology, is there such a thing as a Christian philosophy? Is there such a thing as a separate philosophy? Or is philosophy absorbed into theology and loses a distinction that might need be there? Right? This is a debate that raged between several people: Jacques Maritain, Étienne Gilson, Henri de Lubac, and Maurice Blondel are the main proponents, the main people in this debate, right? Fascinating debate, very interesting, especially if you're a theology nerd like I am. So, just to give you an example, when we look at faith and reason, when we look at theology and philosophy, right? We particularly there's a passage in the First Vatican Council that speaks of these two orders, right? There's the order of reason through which we can come to know that God exists, and then there's the order of revelation, through which we can come to believe through faith in God and see Him through faith, not the light of glory, right? That is after we die and um, enter into our salvation, you might say, into heaven. So here's one way to put it, right? If we think of philosophy and faith over here, and theology and revelation, sorry, let me say that again. Philosophy and reason over here, and theology and faith over here, and we understand that they need to go together, right? But oftentimes, the way in which this section of Vatican I is read later on is that these are two initially disparate orders, or there's a dualism, that need to be brought together because we want to argue that our faith is reasonable, and we want to argue that reason needs revelation to purify it, right? And that is a very true statement, obviously, right? But you see, it's not that way of approaching the question, even though the conclusions are correct, right? Is a way that is extrinsic, right? Rather, we want to have a more intrinsic understanding where think of a circle. I got this from Dr. David Schindler. We're going to be quoting from his book soon. Think of the relationship between faith and reason as a circle, right? You see, philosophy, uh, its starting point is our thinking, right? It's our trying to understand the world that presents itself to our senses. We then abstract, right? This is Thomistic epistemology, and we think through things and we come to certain conclusions, right? Faith, on the other hand, you might say revelation, right, doesn't come through thinking, but rather, in a certain sense, on the opposite end, through hearing, and then thinking about what we've heard follows subsequently. So, one way to think of philosophy and theology or reason and faith is to think in terms of starting points, right? Because a faith that does not think about its content is not really theology, right? And a philosophy that doesn't raise the question of God, right, is not really a philosophy. I mean, you could call it that, but it's not fully philosophical. So what you realize is that the more reason approaches its very center, the more it approaches the very question of what is reason itself, and therefore what is true, right? The truth about truth. The more reason and philosophy come to its intrinsic center, the more it opens itself up to the very question of God. And theology is the study of God, right? Now, the more theology um, approaches its very center, right? The more we get close to our thinking about revelation, about the spoken word of God that is spoken to us, that we hear, believe, and think through, the more it becomes close to the incarnation, right? To the presence of God in the world, right? And then we think about Christ, we think through the logos, the reason of God, right? And so what you see here is from within philosophy and from within theology, there is an inner openness, an intrinsicism, right? Where you cannot separate the two, but they actually belong together initially, prior to our distinction. In fact, this is a famous phrase by Henri de Lubac, who says that, we've often heard the phrase distinguish in order to unite, but de Lubac wants to go back behind all the divisions of the Reformation and of the Enlightenment and of secularity, and he wants to say, first, unite in order to properly distinguish. You see, this is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about extrinsicism and intrinsicism. And so the same thing about the relationship between church and state is here something that emerges, right? Which is that, if we approach this question extrinsically, right, then saying that the church and state must be separate, right, is giving the state an autonomy that actually makes the church irrelevant. This is what we call liberalism. But if you approach the question of the relationship between church and state from an intrinsic perspective, right, then you realize that the church is the one who defines the human person, who defines what reason and freedom and God is, right, and the truth. It bears witness, apostolic witness to the truth. Think of Jesus' conversation with Pilate. He bears witness to the truth. That's why he has authority. Jesus does, right? My authority. And Pilate then has authority, but not from himself, but from God, right? And so we see here that the church is the one that gives the very definitions of things to the state. And then the state is the one here, you might say, that enacts politically, but it answers to something other than itself. This is, in a sense, what Christianity does. It forces the state to have a standard other than itself. It desacralizes, in a certain sense, the state. So here, there's a difference between secularism and secularity, right? Secularity is a concept that we find in the Middle Ages. And so the point here is that we can therefore speak of an autonomy of the secular, an autonomy of the political, an autonomy of the state, where the church does not mingle in its affairs, and yet is present within in an intrinsic way. You see, this resolves so many of the um, tensions that we find in Catholic tradition, especially recently with the document Dignitatis Humanae and the Syllabus of Errors and things like that. For more on this, I would recommend Dr. David Schindler's book, The Politics of the Real, from which we'll read certain excerpts later on. So that's the first thing I wanted to lay on the table, which is this proper understanding of what extrinsicism is. Okay, so the next thing I wanted to talk about is religion, right? So we're talking here about a theology of religions, right? And so, of course, we have to ask the question, well, what is a religion? Before answering the question, what is a religion, we have to first point out what it's not. Now, in what I will describe as what religion is not, there will be a lot of truth to the description, right? Um, but fundamentally, though, there is a miscalculation, a wrong approach that we're going to have to look at. But let me put it to you this way. It's precisely the view that religions are transhistorical essences, systems of doctrine alongside each other that people choose to believe in, right? That eventually leads to religious indifferentism. So, what this means in this understanding of religion, right? We have these essences. Religion is an essence, it's out there. There's several of them, they're alongside each other, and they're transhistorical, right? They're abstracted. We already start to see the extrinsicism, right? And what that means, though, is that for some people, right, particularly for Catholics, you might say, one of these essences is correct and the others are false, right? And so a lot of what I said, right, contains truth in it, as you can tell. But notice the extrinsicism and the assumption of this essence that is not that is abstracted from history, right? Um, the issue here is this: this leads to religious indifferentism precisely because it presupposes the extrinsicism that I've spoken of, but in this case, between history and truth, between religion and culture. So I'm not saying that history is truth and truth is history, right? That would be, that would be historicism, right? Nor am I saying that religion is culture and culture is religion. However, I am saying that these things are not initially disparate. There's no dualism here, although there's a very important distinction. This is what I would say that we would call intrinsicism, right? So, um, this this extrinsicism between history and truth, religion and culture, creates conflicts of power, right? Just think of the famous wars of religion, as they're called, between the Protestant denominations, right? And also think of today in our religiously pluralistic society, right? Um, Religion is said to be a source of violence, right? This is a source of um, of unrest and lack of peace, right? And so we're starting to see how the church wants to affirm the fact that religion is not the source of violence, but precisely the source of peace. And we'll get to that. But you see here um, this conflict of power that this abstraction creates between these different essences, right? It calls for peaceful coexistence. The world, right? Our society says, well, you guys disagree on some fundamental things. You guys ascribe to these different religions. So, in order not to fight and to make this turn into violence, we have to figure out how to have a peaceful coexistence. Now, the problem is that this coexistence subsequently takes on a cultural form, a philosophical worldview that, in the name of peace and public neutrality, right, you can believe that, I can believe this, but in the public sphere, we don't mess with each other. We're neutral, right? This leads ultimately to a philosophy of, you might say, mystical universalism. What does that mean, Dom? Right? What that means is that if all religions, right, have the freedom to, if all people have the freedom to practice their own religion, and there's all these different religions in a neutral public sphere, right? What that means is that all of these religions equally don't matter. They're, in a certain sense, neutralized, right? And what that means is that the only subsequent solution to this that's more positive and less negative would be to say that all religions are just contingent symbols that point to the unnameable mysterious, right? The unnameable mystical experience, right? And hence, we can have a kind of unifying mysticism of all religions, a coexistence that is peaceful. But you see how that completely neutralizes each and every single religion, right? So that's the problem here, is with this initial extrinsicism, right? It actually leads precisely to religious indifferentism. I hope you see that, right? So I want to quote so Pope Benedict in this book, What is Christianity? The Last Writings, quotes Karl Rahner in a way that is relevant to this mystical universalism that I spoke of. So on page 28, I found this very interesting. Let me go ahead and open it up. Wait, what the heck? Here it is, 28. So Karl Rahner said that the Christian of tomorrow will be a mystic, or else he will no longer exist. So Ratzinger is being, well, Benedict at this time, Benedict Emeritus, right, is criticizing Rahner here. And so basically, you can see how this form of understanding thing leads to indifferentism and to a kind of universal, mysticism, right? And so that is Rahner's conclusion. So Benedict says that's a problem. So what's the correct answer, right? How do we understand and approach this very question? Well, I would say, rather, religion is intrinsic to culture and truth is intrinsic to history, in such a way that doctrine And right belief, what we call orthodoxy, right, flows from the encounter with the truth in history, with the truth in person, a person in history. This is what we call the incarnation. This is what we call a tradition. This is what we call the tradition, right? And you see liberalism through all these abstractions is actually trying to circumvent the tradition. It's trying to set up a para tradition, an anti tradition in the tradition of Catholicism, right? Of the form that Catholicism has taken in history, right? And so the exchange of cultures, right, and this understanding of religion purifies the very cultures in question, leading them to their true self, which can only be found in Jesus Christ, the last Adam, the person in history, but at the beginning, at the middle, and at the end of history, right? Only in the last Adam do we encounter the living God. And so this is the path that religions are to trek towards a purification which leads them to the living God in the last Adam, right? Okay, so let's go ahead and read from Benedict XVI's book, What is Christianity? The Last Writings. What an amazing book, man. This is his last one, you know? Um, okay, let's go ahead and begin. All right. If I can get there. Sorry. Here we go. Okay, so here's some relevant passages that are just very enlightening and helpful. So Benedict writes, the Church of Jesus Christ has never been concerned with only one nation or only one culture, but that from the start is what destined. Let me reread that. The Church of Jesus Christ has never been concerned with only one nation or only one culture, but that from the start it was destined for humanity. So sorry, I apologize. Let me finally, repetition is good for learning, right? Let me reread that sentence and add the beginning. It reminds us that the Church of Jesus Christ has never been concerned with only one nation or only one culture, but that from the start it was destined for humanity. He says here, you are co-workers of this peace, and in a divided and violent world, it becomes more and more urgent to build up and to preserve this peace. So the question of peace is very relevant in the modern world, precisely because of the very events that preceded um, our speaking of these topics, right? The wars of religion and then the wars of atheism, you might say, in the previous century. So Ratzinger asks the question: can dialogue replace missionary work? Question mark. Many today indeed have the notion that the world religions should, should respect one another and, in the dialogue between them, become a common force for peace. In this way of thinking, most often the presupposition is that the different religions are variants of one and the same reality, that religion, quote unquote, is the common genus that takes on different forms depending on the different cultures, but expresses the same reality anyway. So here he's saying in a much more beautiful way what I was trying to get at earlier. Okay, he continues here. The world religions are in movement at the historical level, just as nations and cultures are in movement. There are expectant religions. And here below, he says the encounter with him, with Christ, is not the intrusion of something foreign that destroys their own culture and their own history. It is rather an entrance into something greater toward which they are traveling. Therefore, this encounter is always simultaneously a purification and a maturation. Moreover, the encounter is always reciprocal. Reciprocal. Christ awaits their history, their wisdom, their vision of things. I think a good example here might be the wisdom literature in the Old Testament, how Egyptian tradition strongly informs, right? The Hebrew wisdom literature in a beautiful way that progresses and is synthesized and purified, right? He says that new life springs from the encounter of the expectant religions with Christ. So here he has more things to say that I find very enlightening. He says here, religion in itself is not a monolithic phenomenon. Several dimensions must always be distinguished in it. On the one hand, there is the greatness of stretching out beyond the world toward the eternal God. But on the other hand, this greatness contains elements that sprang from the history of mankind and from its practice of religion. Among them, of course, we may find beautiful and noble things, but also base and destructive things, where man's selfishness has taken possession of religion and turned it into a self enclosure instead of an opening. Therefore, religion is never simply a purely positive or purely negative phenomenon. In it, both aspects are mixed. In its beginnings, the Christian mission perceived very forcefully, above all, the negative elements of the pagan religions that it confronted. For this reason, the Christian proclamation was at first extremely critical of religion. Only by overcoming their traditions, which in part it considered even demonic, could the faith display its renovating force. So, again, the awareness of history is a very large and pervasive theme in the theology of Ratzinger Benedict. A nice pithy line here where he says, every religion, in order to remain just, always has to be critical of religion at the same time. And he applies this to Christianity also. We have to be critical of our own history, you know. He continues, on the one hand, it looks with great respect at the interior expectation and the interior wealth of the world religions, but on the other hand, it sees in a critical way what is negative. It goes without saying that again and again the Christian faith must display that critical faculty with respect to its own religious history, too. So I kind of anticipated what he said right there. So now here's where that second sentence I opened with from his letter to Father Pavanka begins to become relevant in our discussion today. Here he says, here's the attitude of the secular enlightened world, right? He says, only critical reason, they say, should direct human action. Behind concepts like this is the conviction that with positivistic thought, reason in all its purity has definitively taken control. And to this he responds, man becomes smaller, not greater, when there is no longer room for an ethos that, in accord with his authentic nature, moves beyond pragmatism, when there is no longer room for a gaze that is turned toward God. There's a beautiful contemplative flavor to his writing that I can never get enough of, right? So I want to close this section with two last quotes here from this first chapter from this wonderful book. He says here, and this is about the missionary elan of Christianity. He'll say more about it later. But he says here, joy needs to be communicated. Love needs to be communicated. Truth needs to be communicated. Someone who has received a great joy cannot simply keep it for himself. He has to hand it on. The same is true for the gift of love and for the gift of recognizing the truth that is manifested. When Andrew met Christ, he could not help telling his brother, "We have found the Messiah." It's from John 1:41. And then here he says, "Let us proclaim Jesus Christ, not in order to gain as many members as possible for our community, much less for the sake of power. Let us speak about him because we feel that we must hand on this joy that was given to us." That's why we evangelize. We will be credible. That, by the way, I added that part. That's why we evangelize. Continuing with his words, we will be credible announcers of Jesus Christ When we have truly encountered him in the depths of our being, when through the encounter with him we have received the gift of the great experience of truth, love, and joy. It's beautiful. Now, without delving into controversial waters, I want to point out, however, the distinction he makes between, right, the evangelism that stems from the most true Christian motive of all evangelism, which is the encounter with the Lord and the change it affects within me, which sends me out on mission to the other, right? I mean, this is the heart of the gospel, right? The heart of the Mass, of the Eucharist, and of mission, right? Communion and mission. You see, that's why we evangelize. But notice how it's not for the sake of power and for the sake of a pragmatist perspective, right? This is more sacramental. This is more intrinsic. Now, on that note, I want to take this opportunity to read a small paragraph from Deus Caritas Est. And this is from paragraph 31, section C in Pope Benedict's encyclical, that's a mouthful, um, on God is love. And he says, charity, furthermore, cannot be used as a means of engaging in what is nowadays considered proselytism. Love is free. It is not practiced as a way of achieving other ends. But this does not mean that charitable activity must somehow leave God and Christ aside, for it is always concerned with the whole man. Often the deepest cause of suffering is the very absence of God. Those who practice charity in the church's name will never seek to impose the church's faith upon others. They realize that a pure and generous love is the best witness to the God in whom we believe and by whom we are driven to love. A Christian knows when it is time to speak of God and when it is better to say nothing and to let love alone speak. He knows that God is love and that God's presence is felt at the very time when the only thing we do is to love. He knows, to return to the question raised earlier, that disdain for love is disdain for God and man alike. It is an attempt to do without God. Consequently, the best defense of God and man consists precisely in love. That's beautiful. It is the responsibility of the church's charitable organizations to reinforce this awareness of their members so that by their activity, as well as their words, their silence, their example, they may be credible witnesses to Christ. Somewhere else in this encyclical, Pope Benedict speaks of the charitable works of the church sometimes needing to rediscover the fact that their task is not merely pragmatic. It's not merely about providing food, shelter, and transportation or commodities to those who lack them, right? Obviously, that's an important part of it. But what the charitable work of the church is, first and foremost, is personal. It's providing God to those who need Him. And how do you do that? By loving those who are lonely, who need love, right? And so charitable work needs to be properly oriented. It needs to be set within the proper hierarchy. So we see how that's something that comes out in his beautiful encyclical, God is Love, Deus Caritas Est. Okay, a few more things about what is religion from his book here. What is Christianity? The Last Writings. So he writes here, when we try to clarify the essence of religion, the first point that emerges is that religion exists only in actual religions. There is no abstract nature of religion, but rather only concrete forms of religion. This seems to leave the attempts to find methods of dialogue in a blind alley. World religions, indeed, appear like a building that embraces continents of space and time. Upon closer inspection, though, it is evident that religions beyond the continents appear as grandiose constructions that, moreover, cannot be presented in a static way, but historically are found to be in movement, whereby they ultimately tend to surpass themselves. In this movement, nevertheless, they are not destroyed, but rather purified and brought back to their more authentic nature. This is what grace does to human nature. This is what Christ does to Adam, right? This is, you know, Catholicism. Much to say there. But continuing this section, these few sections here are very telling. I hope I don't get copyrighted for reading so much from this book. Ignatius Press, I'm advertising for you. Don't sue me. He says the so-called tribal religions, which once were simply described as paganism, recognize gods that are ordered to particular areas of life. The fertility cults are the most visible ones. Their members joyfully venerate the mystery of fertility and thus receive it at the same time in a way that is ever new. Therefore, the essential contents of these cults are diligence in preserving fertility, gratitude for the preservation thereof, and rejoicing over it. In so doing, however, the followers automatically and everywhere reach a point of ecstatic abuse in which the divine and the human elements are intertwined with each other and thus lose their proper dignity. Such a beautiful way to describe this. He continues, in this way, these cults have led to the destruction of entire societies, thus calling into question the very nature of religion. The struggle against these cults with their temptations broadly defines the relation of the biblical faith with regard to religions. What a masterful and fascinating etiology of the relationship between Israel and paganism, right? So it's so amazing. And yet, here's what he writes next, which is equally as interesting. He says, naturally, there is also a positive side to these religions, inasmuch as they are ordered to the preservation and the fertility of the earth. In the society of late antiquity, they appear as nothing less than the essence of paganism, which now is manifested in an altogether positive way in propitiatory processions, in rituals, and similar gestures. Christianity, which at the start was unacquainted with these devotional forms and opposed to the religiosity of the countryside, finally had to adopt, purify, and correct many elements from this setting, but also to accept new overtures and concrete forms of devotion. The so-called litaniae maiores, major litanies, were preserved as prayers of supplication down to the threshold of the present era. Right? I think of rogation days and blessing the fields and the crops that we have in the liturgy. Yeah. What started as paganism, which was opposed to the faith, is today a kind of Christian vision of life and of the world, which unfortunately is destined to die. The world, right? What was apparently pagan, which at the start seemingly had to be eliminated, ultimately contributed to the representation of a life that is received ever anew as coming from God. Okay. In this section, he continues this line of thought in a beautiful way. He writes, I would like to recall here another particularly important area. It concerns the way of dealing with sickness and death. In pagan ritual, there are profoundly moving words and gestures, but also arbitrariness that exploits the challenge posed by sickness and death so as to exert its power in turn. Today, as in the past, the power of magicians defiles the face of the tribal religions. One essential expression of the relation with the dead in all tribal religions is ancestor worship, which for the most part was considered in the past to be in opposition to the Christian vision of life and death. Based on his experience, Horst Berkel proposed a new appropriation and presentation of ancestor worship that to me seems worth considering. He shows that the individualism that developed in the West and puts up the strongest resistance with regard to ancestor worship is in reality opposed also to the Christian anthropology that sees us as being protected within the mystical body of Christ. Man's bond with Christ is not only an I-thou relation, but creates a new we. Communion with Jesus Christ introduces us into the body of Christ. In other words, into the great community of all those who belong to the Lord. And therefore it extends beyond the boundary between death and life. It's beautiful. In this sense, communion with those who have preceded us is an essential part of being a Christian. It enables us to find forms of communion with the dead, which perhaps in Africa manifest themselves differently from the way they do in Europe, but in any case allow us to bring about a richly meaningful transformation of ancestor worship. Okay, now he turns to polytheism, the question of the gods, right? Here's something very interesting. He says, somehow it may always know. Sorry, just a second here. Okay, somehow paganism was. So, sorry, my bad. Somehow polytheism. I apologize. I'm trying to figure out what the heck this sentence means. How it was always known that the. Oh, okay, I got it. Sorry. Okay, here we go. Somehow it was always known that the gods are not simply the plural of God. God is a God in the singular. He exists solely in unity. The plurality of the gods works at another level. In fact, the world with its different areas is ruled by deities that can dominate only their one part of the world. Now, here's the paragraph that I love here, right here. It gives you a profound insight into the very nature of Christianity. He writes, as for the one God, what Eric Peterson wrote about him in his important early monograph, Monotheism as a Political Problem, is true. Le roi règne, mais il ne gouverne pas. The king reigns, but he does not govern. Over the course of the history of religions, God was considered as a monarch who does have power over everything, but does not exercise it. The one true God needs no worship because he does not threaten anyone and does not need the help of anyone. The goodness and the power of the one true God determine at the same time his significance. He does not need us, and man thinks that he does not need God. With the proliferation of faith in the gods, there was increasingly a yearning that the true God, with his power, could liberate man from the regime of fear within which faith in the gods had developed extensively. According to the conviction of Christians, this was precisely what happened with Jesus. The one God entered into the history of religions and deposed the gods. Henri de Lubac especially has demonstrated that Christianity was perceived as liberation from the fear in which the power of the gods had shackled man. Basically, the mighty world of the gods crumbled because the one God entered the scene and set a limit to their power. I mean, this is straight from St. Paul. We're liberated from, we used to live under the powers and principalities of this world. And then Origen talks about this, and Augustine. So to conclude this section, I have two passages. Ratzinger writes, there are two ways out of faith in the gods. First, the monotheistic religions rooted in Abraham, in which the one God as a person causes the whole world. Besides this, there is a second way out, namely the mystical religions with Hinayana Buddhism as a central form. Here, there is no one personal God, but rather even the one God is dissolved and becomes evanescent. The way of Buddha tends toward annihilation. In reality, this severe form of mystical dissolution of all individual figures did not prevail, but in recent times, it always remained as a final description and acquired a strong, attractive force precisely in the once Christian cultures of Europe. In the German-speaking world, it found an expression in the sentence attributed to Karl Rahner: "The Christian of tomorrow will be a mystic, or else he will no longer exist." So obviously, Ratzinger sides on the first path, right? Not the second. In fact, that is what his book, Truth and Tolerance, that I showed in the beginning, is all about. And it's a brilliant, beautiful book. And to end with the last quote here, he writes, "The whole quarrel in the history of religions between God and the gods does not end with the fact that God himself finally vanishes like a fetish. Rather, it ends with the victory of the one true God over the gods who are not God. It ends, consequently, with the gift of love that presupposes the personal being of God. Therefore, for man, too, it ends with the fact that he fully becomes a person by accepting the gift of being loved by God and by handing it on." Evangelization mission, right? So that's that section. That's actually everything in this book that I wanted to read. That's perfect because I was hoping this wouldn't go longer. Okay, so let's see what I wanted to talk about next. So I have two final things I want to offer in this presentation um, before concluding, right? And the first thing is, in light of all this, I want to read the two particular sections in Pope Benedict XVI's Regensburg address, right? Because what we're dealing with is, just to recap a little bit what we've been talking about. The first thing we want to say is that in our world today, right, we have a new situation. Who was it that described? I think it was what's his name? Uh, uh, he wrote about technology. Um, um, McLuhan, right? Marshall McLuhan. He had a quote, something like, "In today's world, um, uh, the world is like uh, one large village or something." I don't remember the exact quotes. I'm radically paraphrasing. What he meant, though, is that now with our technology, our communication, our awareness, you know, the entire globe has become like one village. And by that, what he meant is that in a village, when someone does something, you know about it, right? There's all this gossip. We know about the blacksmith's son, what he, how he's courting the daughter of uh um the bread maker, right? Or so, I don't, rumors, gossip, everyone knows what everyone's doing. It's the small town, right? And all its charm. But that's something that's, in a certain sense, happened on a global scale in our world today. And in a certain sense, it brings people closer together in one sense, in a way that was impossible before. And also, as we all know too well, it separates people and creates more isolation. Um, but I say that because why did I say that? Because this raises the question of all of these different cultures and their religions, right? And so the first thing to do is to realize that when we're talking about religion, right, we're talking about something distinct from culture, but not extrinsic from culture, right? And when we're talking about truth, we're talking about something that we can distinguish from history and must be distinguished from history, but can not be separated from history, cannot be construed as extrinsic from history. And what that means is that we come to encounter truth and true religion only in history and its unfolding. And that true religion and truth is precisely what makes communion possible. And this communion is offered to all humanity. And this communion does not destroy human nature or human culture, but purifies human nature and human culture, elevates and unifies. This is Catholicism. This is Catholicism. And so I want to end end first with the Regensburg Address, two particular relevant passages. And finally, I'll end with a beautiful and very profound proposal from David Schindler in his book, The Politics of the Real. So let me go ahead and read the relevant passages. I'll go ahead and share my screen, actually. Okay. So here, Pope Benedict XVI, in his famous or infamous, however you see it, Regensburg address, speaks of the nature of modern secular rationality. These two bullet points right here that you see me highlighting are not part of the address. They're notes that I've inscribed in the address. But he basically characterizes the nature of modern secular rationality, what is acceptable in the public square in the Western world, as being comprised of an element of mathematical idealism and an element of empirical um, empiricism, right? The empirical criteria of repetition verification, what some generally call the scientific method, right? So you have both a kind of extrinsic idealism that, in a certain sense, is Platonic and Cartesian, and also a very strong materialism, right? That is actually a denial of the metaphysical, which is fascinating, right? You see how, again, this extrinsicism paradoxically creates collapses, right? While an intrinsicism actually makes possible and secures proper distinctions that are absolutely fundamental. In other words, as de Lubac would say, you unite in order to distinguish. And so it's such a brilliant theological principle that has proved so powerful in thinking through various subjects, in theology, for me at least. Okay, so first, Ratzinger or Benedict says, only the kind of certainty resulting from the interplay of mathematical and empirical elements can be considered scientific. And this is in today's secular public sphere and secular world, right? Second, he writes, this method excludes the question of God, making it appear an unscientific or pre-scientific question. So, I mean, I'm preaching to the choir here, hopefully, right? You guys know what Benedict is talking about here, right? This is the nature of the landscape. So he continues here below. If science as a whole is this and this alone, then it is man himself who ends up being reduced. For the specifically human questions about our origin and destiny, the questions raised by religion and ethics, then have no place within the purview of collective reason as defined by science, so understood, and must thus be relegated to the realm of the subjective. The subjective then decides on the basis of, sorry, let me reread that. The subject then decides on the basis of his experiences what he considers tenable in matters of religion, and the subjective conscience becomes the sole arbiter of what is ethical. In this way, though, ethics and religion lose their power to create a community and become a completely personal matter. Again, another paradox. By making it purely subjective, it's impossible to therefore be a truly personal matter. And then this last quote right here, this is a dangerous state of affairs for humanity, as we see from the disturbing pathologies of religion and reason, which necessarily erupt when reason is so reduced that questions of religion and ethics no longer concern it. So that's the first section I wanted to read from. I'm going to skip this part, but you see the relevance, of this passage based on everything we've been discussing in this presentation. And I want to end with his conclusion here. Okay. He concludes his address at the University of Regensburg as follows. Only thus do we become capable of that genuine dialogue of cultures and religions so urgently needed today. In the Western world, it is widely held that only positivistic reason and the forms of philosophy based on it are universally valid. Yet the world's profoundly religious cultures see this exclusion of the divine from the universality of reason as an attack on their most profound convictions. A reason which is deaf to the divine and which relegates religion into the realm of subcultures is incapable of entering into the dialogue of cultures. Every line he writes is just powerful. He continues, at the same time, as I have attempted to show, modern scientific reason, with its intrinsically Platonic element, bears within itself a question which points beyond itself and beyond the possibilities of its methodology. So that's an opening there for apologetics, you might say. Modern scientific reason quite simply has to accept the rational structure of matter and the correspondence between our spirit and the prevailing rational structures of nature as a given on which its methodology has to be based. This point right here is, a one-line summary of an entire section of his book, Introduction to Christianity. And so the last few quotes are as follows. Yet the question why this has to be so is a real question, and one which has to be remanded by the natural sciences to other modes and planes of thought, to philosophy and theology. For philosophy, and albeit in a different way for theology, listening to the great experiences and insights of the religious traditions of humanity, and those of the Christian faith in particular, is a source of knowledge, and to ignore it would be an unacceptable restriction of our listening and responding. You see how he is attacking the bracketing off into subcultures of the way of knowing that religious tradition brings to the table. It's being oppressed by the secular ideology that reduces man and questions of his origin and destiny and all questions of God. I'm thinking of the Lubach's book, The Drama of Atheist Humanism, and the reduction of man. But you see, it's the humanity of God that the church proposes, right? It's the incarnation, right? It's the logos, the full breadth of reason, right, that the church proposes. And so he concludes with these two verses. The West has long been endangered by this aversion to the questions which underlie its rationality, and can only suffer great harm thereby. The courage to engage the whole breadth of reason and not the denial of its grandeur. And he concludes, it is to this great logos, to this breadth of reason, that we invite our partners in the dialogue of cultures. To rediscover it constantly is the great task of the university. What a beautiful lecture. There's so much to it, of course. Okay, we've reached the final part of this presentation, and that is a few things that David Schindler writes in his book, The Politics of the Real. So, after having spent much time defining and critiquing liberalism in a way that's very thorough and fascinating, David Schindler turns to what Catholicism has to say in response. And a big part of this book is also showing how Catholicism actually can deliver on the promises of liberalism. And he also shows that liberalism itself cannot and has not delivered on its own promises, but Catholicism can. And so this is what's so brilliant about this book. But let me go ahead and just read to you these sections that are directly relevant to what we're talking about today. Schindler writes, the right to freedom of religion, liberally understood, is a right that destroys the very thing it pretends to grant. Destroys in the sense of denatures, or in other words, changes the defining essence of, so that it becomes something radically different. This is a more intelligent way of saying what I said earlier, which is that in the name of neutrality and tolerance, right, secularism neutralizes and therefore is intolerant. And it denatures religion, right? He says to embrace religious liberty in the liberal sense is not so much to opt for fairness in religion as it is to opt for fairness rather than religion, or even more accurately, to transform fairness into a religion of its own, a religion that positively excludes all others. That's so brilliant. It's so brilliant. And he says here, the positive and substantial interpretation of religious freedom we have tried to present here, the Catholic one, right, allows a recognition of religions, at least the traditional religions, precisely as religions, which is to say, not simply as private belief coupled with public acts of piety and implying at most certain historically distinctive way. Oops, sorry, my bad. I forgot to highlight the rest of that. Let me reread that whole section right there. I apologize. So to reread that quote, it's an important quote. Pay attention. It's really enlightening. The positive and substantial interpretation of religious freedom we have tried to present here allows a recognition of religions precisely as religions, which is to say, not simply as private belief coupled with public acts of piety and implying at most certain moral prescriptions, but as total expressions of human existence, as each an integral form that gathers up human nature in human culture, opening these into their theological depth and doing so in a concrete, historically distinctive way. A genuinely Catholic sense of religious freedom, thus, can in principle do greater justice even to non Christian religions than liberalism can, because it can honor them more amply than can liberalism as what they properly understand themselves to be. And this section as well, right? He continues, moreover, what is distinctive about Catholic Christianity is, as we have argued, its being more than merely religious. Its integration of the Greek sense of nature, which as nature has an intrinsic universality, and the Roman sense of legal institution, which likewise has an intrinsic aspiration to universality, the Pax Augusta. This implies, in principle, a disposition to respect for what is genuinely other, not in the form of a tolerance that is by definition superficial, but out of a theologically grounded, affirmative commitment to the flourishing of human nature along with its cultural expression. It has been observed that the High Middle Ages represented a unique moment of genuine intercultural exchange among Muslims, Jews, and Christians, and that this was due in part to the discovery of philosophy, and thus of nature and reason. And he qualifies that later more, but here's where I was. This is the goal of the place I'm trying to reach here. Schindler says, if a Catholic sense of freedom is made central, traditional religion would certainly warrant a greater share in the public space, a greater recognition of sharing in the res publica than mere arbitrary individual ideas about higher powers and so forth. And above all, respect would be granted to the religions that have in fact contributed to the shape of Western civilization. And here's the line: Catholic religious liberty is not meant to be only Catholic, but specifically as Catholic is Catholic. All of that said, Schindler continues, it is also the case that a Catholic sense of religious liberty cannot affirm other religions simply as religions and in exactly and entirely the same way their adherents affirm them. In particular, the Church cannot affirm the rejection of Christ. The capacity to honor other religions that we mentioned above is not an abstract principle that sees all religions as worshiping the same God in different ways, which would lead to the various paradoxes we have indicated, and ultimately does not do any justice to any religion. It is a principle, he says in this section, it is a principle that recognizes in a prudential way the good of public order and peace and the distinctively political aspect of the promotion of the common good. But what is clear is the fact that the question of the truth of religion cannot simply be set aside. In fact, the question of truth is what makes religious liberty possible in a way that can deliver, unlike the religious liberty of liberalism, which is merely a neutralizing, right, an oppression of religion, a attack on what it actually is. And so that leads me to the last quote I wanted to read, where he says, if we approach this question from the perspective of reality and in relation to the actuality of tradition, you see all of this intrinsicism, right? Not extrinsicism. If we approach this question from the perspective of reality and in relation to the actuality of tradition, we recognize that religious dialogue is profoundly different in every particular case. There is the ecumenical question within Christianity, the dialogue with Judaism, with Islam, and with other traditional ways of reflecting the divine order in existence. These are not just different religions, they are complete ways of life with their own history and their own way of interpreting the whole of reality, from the nature of God to the nature of man. So, those relevant passages from Schindler's book here um, are basically showing how Catholicism, precisely in the upholding of the truth of its tradition as Catholic, is able to deliver where liberalism abysmally fails, and in a way that actually um, makes peace possible and evangelization fruitful, because of the very principle that holds all together, which is Christ. This is what I meant in an interview I did with Dr. Larry Chapp on his YouTube channel, Gaudium et Spes 22, when I said that the theology of Ratzinger, de Lubac, Balthasar, and Schindler in this case, right, uh, made me understand that in this globalized world, um, you know, the options between liberalism and integralism, right, were on a spectrum that needed to be transcended. You see, the title of this book is The Church Between Liberalism and Integralism, right? And the transcending of this spectrum is the politics of the real, as the title of the book calls it, right? And reality, the res publica, the public reality, the public real thing, right? And so, in other words, Catholicism, precisely as universal, right, and applicable to all men, all cultures, to human nature. You see, we get this from the Greeks and their concept of physis, right, of nature. And so you see, um, a Catholic understanding of religious liberty enables a more Catholic Catholicism that does not compromise with the truth in a liberal way. The vision here of these theologians is uh, very what's the word I'm looking for? It's very ambitious. In fact, that's part of its problem. It's I think it's a correct vision, obviously, but it's so ambitious that it's a struggle to first of all come to terms with what it is, what this vision is, and then subsequently, trying to instantiate it, through the work of the church. Um, but this is the direction that Catholicism, from within its very essence, right, um, is headed towards, right? Catholicism cannot head towards anything other than the universal communion of the human family in the last Adam. It's not possible. So this is true, is what I'm saying. So this was a long presentation. It is overly technical. I know some of you that watch are like, "What the hell is Dom talking about?" Yeah, fair enough. But this is the vision of Ratzinger, Schindler. A lot of this starts with Henri de Lubac. His book. Actually, I want to end with a quote. This will be the way I'll end this whole video, and then I'm gonna log off because I gotta go. So let me end with this quote, if I can find it. So this one is from John Henry Newman, Saint John Henry Newman. Please find it. Please find it. Here it is. Aha. Ooh, it's kind of long. Never mind. It's too long. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put it in the show notes. So I recommend you read this quote in the show notes. So I'd like to conclude with the fact that um, what the Catholic Church has done is she said, as we opened up with this quote from Benedict Emeritus before he died, right? Um, the radical need for a theology of religions is something that needs to be properly addressed, right? And also the extrinsicism and the liberalism in our understanding of what religion is needs to be changed, right? We need to really come to terms with reality and what religion actually is. And so religion is intrinsic to history and culture, although we can distinguish it from those, right? But which means that they're not these trans-historical substances, these, you might say, doctrinal systems that subcultures assent to, right? That are tolerated by the states, which leads to indifferentism and ultimately the neutralization of human nature, I would argue. We see this liberalism neutralizes human nature, hence the radical individualism. That then you get into Jean-Paul Sartre, and then the kind of nihilism that's there. And these theologians, man, they have answers to all this in a way that really has baffled me. Like, I'm sold. Okay, that'll be all for today. If you enjoy this kind of content, please leave a like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. And if you want me to keep making videos, and if you want them to get better, and if you want to help me with my studies, consider supporting me at patreon.com/the Logos Project. And you can find everything Logos Project related at my website, theecclesiablog.com. And so, without further ado, we'll see you all next time. God bless. Thanks, everybody.